Good afternoon. Was that too loud? It is good to have you all here this afternoon. Thank you for coming in for the first of two very important information sessions that we're offering here at Epworth. A little background that I'll offer, probably about, I think it was in our April church council meeting. It may have been March. I'm trying to remember. I think it was March. I trust Lisa. She knows better than I do. But the question was brought before the church council whether or not we might explore moving toward the Global Methodist Church as proposed by the Wesley Covenant Association. That because of changes, my understanding, the reason that's been given, that because of changes to the scheduled date of General Conference, that the WCA had decided that as of today, May 1st, they were going to be receiving churches into the Global Methodist Church, and members of Epworth wanted to explore whether or not that was something our congregation would want to do. So the purpose here today is simply to offer information. If we decide to move forward, the time will come where there will be a church conference. You'll learn more about that in just a few minutes. But at that church conference, the full membership of Epworth United Methodist Church, all of those professing members of our church, will be given a vote and will be able to choose whether they want to move forward with disaffiliation from the United Methodist Church or not. The vote, in my opinion, will be just that simple, but that's not simple at all, is it? And I thought that perhaps we would want some information regarding that so that we can make wise decisions. So we've got two different sets of speakers coming in. The first today is our district superintendent, Dan Pezet, representing the Metro District. He's going to explain to us some of what's involved toward the process of disaffiliation, should we choose that. And so he's going to be offering that information. And then also, just for a little background of what's brought us to this point and what might lie ahead for us, I invited Andy and Sally Langford to come and speak. All three of these are colleagues of mine in the Western North Carolina Conference, ordained elders in our conference. They've served churches in this area. You served at Central and until retirement, is that correct? And Sally served a number of churches as well as serving as district superintendent. They've been friends of this congregation a long time. And I've heard several speak that you not only know them professionally through the church, but you also know them socially because they are our neighbors here in the Concord area. I thought they could represent very fairly what may lie in store for the United Methodist Church. I also invited them in because of a family connection that a lot of Duke Divinity School graduates might share. Your daddy was one of my favorite professors at Duke. And I just have an abiding love of the effect he still has on my ministry and the desire to seek after Jesus Christ in all we say and do. And so I thank you for your willingness to come. Next week, I have another friend coming. This is Jeff Patterson. Jeff was my district superintendent when I served in Surrey County. And Jeff is the current president of the Wesley Covenant Association for Western North Carolina. He's been very active in moving toward the change to the Global Methodist Church. He'll be coming in next Sunday in order to explain to us what that process would be and why that body now exists. My desire is that we have a fair and open conversation. And I think what I said to you this morning, I still stand by this afternoon, which means I did something right in worship today, at least one thing. And that is that we come into this with prayerful, open minds. That we seek not our will, but God's will in all these things. Because I will share with you my personal feeling. This is not our church. This is God's church. And we are God's people. And we want to be where He would have us be. Amen? So, with that being said, just a little bit more instruction of what's going to happen. I'm going to let Dan go first to share, and then Andy and Sally to share as they feel called. We have gone back and forth on this. Toward the end, we're going to open things up for questions. The desire was at first that for your comfort, we might just have you write down questions on cards. They'd be turned in to Bob Caruth, our church council chair, who's going to serve as moderator. And Bob would then read those questions to our panel and have them respond. Some others had said, no, they'd like to speak for themselves, and if that's where the comfort level is, that's fine. We're going to do a hybrid of that. We're going to do both. If you prefer to write down questions, raise your hand. I'll be glad to bring you a card. Or if you prefer to hold the microphone for a moment, we'll make sure you get that and that you can speak accordingly with whatever question or comment you might want to make. So that will happen toward the end, but we'll let them make their presentation first. Be mindful also that this is being live streamed, so it will be available online through our website and through YouTube through the end of May. We're going to put it up there just for a limited time to give all of our members an opportunity to be able to see that. Maybe observe it again, even though you've been here, you might want to watch it again just to make sure that what was said is what you heard, so that we're all working with correct information. Any questions about our format for today? If not, let's go to the Lord in prayer. Heavenly Father, we thank you that you meet us here on those Sunday mornings when worship is a great celebration. Lord, we feel your presence and we thank you. When we gather for a funeral or for another special tender time, Lord, you meet us there and you let us lean upon you. And even in meetings such as we're having today, where feelings run strong and where understanding is what we need most of all, Lord, you meet us here. And you help provide that understanding. Let your Spirit interpret to each of our hearts what it is we need to learn this day, so that we might do today and always those things that reflect the love of Jesus Christ alive in the world, those things that prove that your kingdom has come near. Thank you for our speakers, and thank you for those members who have gathered with us in person and those who are gathering with us online. Guide us, Lord, to do your work and your will. In Jesus' name, amen. Dan, if you'd like to come forward. And thank you for being here.
Thank you, Bill. Thank you for inviting me to come, and good evening, everyone. It's great to be here. I am the district superintendent of the Metro District, and just to give that little bit of a background, the Metro District is about 116 churches in this greater Charlotte area. We are one of 8 districts in the conference, in the Western North Carolina Conference, that comprises over 1,000 churches in the western half of North Carolina. And so we are connected. Each one of those 8 districts has a district superintendent, and we, within the Western North Carolina, have a bishop over all of us, and that is Bishop Carter. And Bishop Carter is new to us, currently serving both the Florida Conference and the Western North Carolina Conference. Part of that is because of some of the unusual circumstances that the COVID-19 has brought upon us without having General Conference and being able to elect other bishops. As Bishop Leland retired, Bishop Carter took this conference in addition to his current conference because we were not able to elect bishops. Hopefully that ruling will come out soon and we'll be able to elect bishops soon. So I just wanted to give you that kind of lay of the land of the connection that we're a part of as the United Methodist Church, that we're not just one church, but we are a connection of churches within the Western North Carolina Annual Conference. We then join other conferences in the Southeast to become the Southeastern jurisdiction. And from there, we join the General Church, which is a global United Methodist Church. So we're part of a big connection, and this big connection, of course, gets together and creates the set of rules, the policies, the polity that guide us in being United Methodist. And some of that is what is in question about how we move forward as a United Methodist Church. Now, I was asked to come and to present to you a little bit about a process of what that would look like if a church wanted to leave the denomination and go with the newly formed Global Methodist Church. I'm going to depend a lot tonight on your questions. I'd like for this to be a conversation. I want to answer the questions that you have rather than being a talking head and give you bullet points. Part of the awkwardness of this conversation is that I do not have much new to pitch to you. This is not a sales call. This is not me saying, hey, come and be a part of the United Methodist Church. You have been a part of the United Methodist Church. You know what this looks like. You know the ministry of the church. And if you are connected enough to the connection, you know that outside these walls, in this community and outside these walls, there are great things going on in ministry in the United Methodist Church, things that we do as local congregations, and things that we do when we gather and collaborate together to do things worldwide that one single congregation cannot do. So I could make that pitch to you tonight. I could tell all sorts of great stories about the United Methodist Church to try to convince you the United Methodist Church is the way to go. But it is my hope and prayer that as a United Methodist, you already know these things, and that I don't need to put those on a PowerPoint and a bullet point and share that with you, that you already know these things in your heart. So it's not that I'm here to pitch something new or to convince you of one thing or another. I'm here to clarify things and to answer your questions. So please, flag bill down. If you have a question to write on a piece of paper, we have some really great expertise here in the Langfords that is just a blessing to have in the room. My goodness, thank you both for being here. They have, I saw Hamilton last week, the musical, last week. I guess today is the first day of the week. So I saw that Thursday night. It was my first experience of Hamilton. But these two have been in the room when it's happened. That's a line from Hamilton. So they have been at these general conference meetings. They have a history and a personal experience of what has been going on. So please flag bill down if you have specific questions that you want to make sure we hit tonight, because this is going to be very conversational. We're going to have a conversation, and I'm going to ask them to pipe in as they have any insight, and I'll give insight along the way. I will start out the conversation while we're waiting to field questions and just say a couple of things that are on my mind and heart about where we are right now. Of course, the chief issue, the issue that seems to have risen to the top, although it is certainly not the only issue, is around human sexuality and the future of the United Methodist Church concerning human sexuality, the ordaining of homosexual pastors or LGBTQ plus pastors, and whether or not we will offer same-sex unions or marriages within the United Methodist Church. That seems to be the primary issue, and of course, that is the only issue right now with which a church may disaffiliate from the United Methodist Church. So let me say a little bit more about that. The United Methodist Church is part of a mainline tradition. That mainline word is definitely a loaded word that has meaning to it. It means that, among other things, that we are connected to the apostolic tradition of church. So one of the biggest gifts that I received, one of the most valuable gifts to me that I received when I was ordained as an elder in the church, was a list of bishops going back to John Wesley. So Bishop Leland is the bishop that ordained me. And then it had the bishop that ordained him, and I'm drawing a blank on who that was. I'll think about it in a moment. And then the bishop that ordained him, all the way back to John Wesley. And we know that once we go back to John Wesley, that we can go back to the Anglican Church to where he was ordained. And from the Anglican Church, we can go back to the Catholic Church. And with some controversy in some places down in the history of our Christian life, we can trace that all the way back to Peter. And so we have this apostolic tradition of the church. We are connected to the Catholic Church in that way that broke off to the Anglican Church, that broke off to the United Methodist Church, and we carry those traditions. Part of those traditions is that we have churches that are in trust of the whole church. So when you're a member locally of Epworth United Methodist Church, you are a member of the United Methodist Church. And the church itself is managed and you oversee the property of Epworth United Methodist Church, but the property is held in trust for the whole church because this church is part of the mission and vision of the entire church. So what that means for our mainline churches, there is usually this thing called a trust clause that's built into deeds that's part of the property that says this property is held in trust for the overall United Methodist Church. It's a very important, Epworth United Methodist Church, you are a very important part of the strategic witness of the United Methodist Church. If you were not here, we would need to decide how this area would be served by the United Methodist Church. So that's where the trust clause comes in, is that it's this idea that the church is not a local congregation in and of itself. You are part of a larger whole. In fact, it's easier to know for those of you who have Catholic upbringing, and usually in a group this size among Methodists, someone will have been raised Catholic. And you will know this to be true. Catholic churches, they do not raise money for their own Catholic church when they're looking to add on, like if you wanted to add a preschool wing. In fact, my brother's church, he's Catholic, just did this. They raised $1 million and they were going to add a preschool wing. And the bishop, which is for the Catholic church, that's really a district superintendent, the bishop said, "Oh, thank you for raising that $1 million. We needed that for Central Concord over here." And see, for the Catholic church, that's how they look at their property, is that it's all by the diocese. And they can manipulate that property in that form or fashion. That's the history that we come from. Of course, the United Methodist Church, we allow for local congregations to manage your property a little bit more independently. But it's that kind of idea that the church comes from. And that's where the rub is around property. If you wanted to leave the United Methodist Church, it's not that any one local church owns the property. It's held in trust with the whole church. And so a church just can't leave the denomination with its property. That's one of the key issues here, and I'll turn to Andy. Anything, if you have something to pipe in on anything that I hit, or clarifying statements. So that's part of the issue with all of the conversation. There's always a way to move from one denomination to another. There's always been. The usual way that would happen would be when someone says, I just don't feel like I'm called to be a part of this congregation anymore, and so I'm going to ask for a transfer of letter to another church. And so we've had that happen where a family might feel like they need to go and join the United Methodist Church across town or the Baptist Church across the street. That's been something that is fairly common. As we move forward here with the conversation specifically around human sexuality, there have been entire congregations that have felt we would like to leave the denomination. And because of that conversation, going back to general conferences, there has been a pathway that has been established. It's a new paragraph in the discipline, paragraph 2553, that allows congregations to leave with their property if they meet certain conditions. And one of the chief and primary criteria is that I'm especially part of making in the decision-making process is the church's view on human sexuality different than the denomination's or the action of the annual conference? And that's the only way that 2553 can be implemented or used today. So in order to use 2553 for a congregation to leave with their property, there must be a disagreement on human sexuality. Other reasons for leaving are not valid. For example, if you're upset that the bishop put Bill Roberts as your pastor, that is not a valid reason to leave the denomination as a church. If you are upset with apportionments, the connectional giving system of the United Methodist Church, where we all participate in ministry together financially beyond the local church, that is not a valid reason to leave the denomination. If you have a disagreement on any other point of theology. That is not up for discussion in paragraph 2553. It is specifically about human sexuality. So that is the way to leave. There is another paragraph. I'm going to try to hit a couple of common rumors that I hear along the way. There is another paragraph, 2548.2, in the discipline that has been there since the 70s that some people believe should be allowed to be used for their church to leave. And it is possible. That is a possible paragraph to leave the denomination, but under very specific circumstances and two very specific places. So 2548.2 allows a church to leave the denomination and transfer the property to another Wesleyan denomination. And this Wesleyan denomination must be one that we have a comity agreement with, which is to say that we have worked out a way that the trust clause will be passed from our denomination to another denomination. This was put in the discipline back when there was a time of racial tension in our country, and specifically it was put in for the ability for churches to leave or even come back into the church from the AME Zion or the AME church. And that paragraph is still in there. And the issue with that paragraph right now specifically is that to transfer to the GMC or an independent church, we don't have that comity agreement. We don't have that relationship with the new denomination to move the trust clause from our denomination to the next. So because of that, we cannot use 2548.2 to transfer. So you might hear that said. There is a push. There's even a petition to the annual conference this year that would direct our annual conference and trustees and cabinet to accept 2548.2. The problem with that is the annual conference does not have the authority to rewrite the discipline. And so that petition most likely will not be presented in its current language, at least. It needs some changes before that would be ruled in order. I can't speak to whether or not it would be ruled in order, but if I were to put on my lens, I would guess that it needs some changes first. So 2548.2 is one that I often hear, and so the answer there is no, that's not going to be considered. So 2553 is the process for disaffiliation. It's only around the area of human sexuality. And 2553 has a very specific way of going through it. Now, one of the interesting things about 2553 is that the way that we've implemented it in Western North Carolina very similarly models a document called the Protocol that was presented to, it would have gone before General Conference if we would have had the next General Conference. So the Protocol agreement is an agreement that people from many different sides of this conversation came together and signed. Our bishop, our current bishop, Bishop Carter, is one of the signatories of the Protocol agreement. It also had representatives from the Good News Movement, from the WCA, from other more progressive groups. And the Protocol agreement was going to be presented, and because we did not have General Conference, it was not able to be presented as a way forward. However, we do have paragraph 2553 that gives annual conferences the ability to set specific ways for a church to leave the denomination, and our conference has chosen to model after the Protocol agreement for churches to leave. So that's one thing that when I hear sometimes someone saying that we have a process that's not fair, my response to that is our process models the process that was agreed upon by all sides and would have been presented at General Conference. And I'm looking because you'll have a little bit more inside information on some of this. So from there, what you know is that the process that we use for 2553 models that, and with a couple of differences. One is that we ask for anyone using 2553, one, it must be human sexuality related. We ask that each church that disaffiliates be current in its current year of apportionments. That's the connectional giving part of our budget. And pay 1 year forward in support of the United Methodist ministry in connectional giving. And to pay the pension liability for our pastors. The way that our pension works is that we project that pension expense out, I believe it's 20 years, and there's a pension liability that each church continues to pay, and we've projected that into the future, expecting our churches to stay in the denomination. And if a church leaves the denomination, that puts the other churches that are left in the position of paying the pension liability that your church had. And so in order to be fair and just, we ask that a church pay that pension liability into the future. That tends to be the most expensive part of the disaffiliation. Then we also ask if you've received a conference or district grant that has helped to pay for ministry or improvements in the building in the last 10 years, that those be repaid because those grants were given in good faith, that it would promote the ministry of the United Methodist Church into the future. And that's the three financial things that we ask for. So there's some rumors out there that we have these extra fees or exorbitant somethings, or that it's, arbitrary, we just pick a number and try to punish a church with a large number. Those rumors are not true. That's the formula that we use that I just went over to identify your financial obligation for leaving the denomination. And that is a really gracious position when you consider that if it were to go to legal, where nobody wants this to go, but to go to legal and lawsuits and all that, the courts have sided with the church on the trust clause that a church may not leave with the property. So this is a way to leave with the property in what is considered a fair and just way by all sides. All sides sign that document. From there, if your church were to decide to disaffiliate, there would need to be a church-wide vote. Under 2553, it requires a 2/3 majority vote to disaffiliate. And that's one of the differences between the 2553 and the protocol. The protocol requires 57%. Due to disciplinary rules, it has to stay at 66% for 2553. And that one important thing I want to say about that is no church must vote. There is nothing that says you have to decide this tomorrow. That's some of the anxiety with a denomination launching May 1st. Some people say, we have to decide by May 1st. I guarantee you the GMC will take you after May 1st. If you're not ready today, they will take you. There's no anxiety. That's just a word of caution from me. Be careful of anybody who wants to raise anxiety or fear. There's no need for anxiety or fear, and people who tend to try to raise anxiety or fear, they're trying to motivate you toward a response. So just be careful when you hear anxiety or fear enter that conversation. So there's nothing that says the church must vote. If your church is happy, if you are experiencing ministry in a life-giving way and you want to continue, by all means continue. There is no need to vote. There is no need to make any sort of changes. In fact, regardless of what happens, and I can't predict the future, I could put on my crystal ball lens and tell you that my guess is that we would be moving in the next 12 to 20 years towards a centrist or kind of middle-of-the-road denomination where each church would be able to decide its own conscience on the issue of human sexuality. That's not official. I'm just giving you my guess, and my guess is as worth as anyone's guess in the room. And there are several reasons why I think that way. One of them is just very practical in the way that I see the voting go and what types of votes would be needed to make certain kinds of changes. But what I want you to know about that is that as United Methodists, we have differed on key issues for a long time and still have had effective ministry. We differ on things from abortion to capital punishment, to political parties and affiliation, what that might look like. We differ in a lot of ways. And our cabinet, the district superintendents and bishops, when they get together and they try to help decide the leadership of your church for the future, we take all of those things into consideration when making an appointment. For example, there was one church I was appointed to as pastor. The district superintendent called me up and said, "Hey, Dan, how are you on guns?" Come to find out, the lay leader owned a gun range. If I were a pacifist, no one should own a gun, I'm working to amend the Second Amendment. If I were to go in that direction, that would not have been the church for me. I would not have been successful there. And that's something that the cabinet had foresight to think through. Just like today, when we're appointing someone, we try to match pastors with congregations in that way, and we've been doing that for some time. Our cabinet has gone a step further to say, if there is any confusion or any doubt, your church has any concern over this, then we will offer you an extended profile. So every year, anybody here on the staff parish committee, staff parish team, we have one over here, some staff. So every year, your church has the opportunity to fill out what's called a profile. And it goes in our computer system, and this profile tells us all about your church. And we use this information to tell pastors that might come. So when Bill came, we read to Bill some things that you put on your profile to let him know about your church. And so we're offering an extended profile to churches. If you want to have on your profile that you would not receive a LGBTQ pastor and that your church will not do same-sex unions, then our cabinet will honor that. I say all of that with a grain of salt right now because if someone calls my office today and asks, if a pastor calls my office today and asks, "Hey, Dan, can I do a same-sex union?" I say no, because it's against the rules. It's the discipline says no. So I say all of that. This is one way that we assure you that we will honor your church and allow your church to decide its own conscience in this matter. Sometimes when I say that, churches will say, "Well, then why are we meeting like this? If you're not going to make us do something that we believe is wrong, why are we meeting like this?" And sometimes I say, "Exactly. We can agree to disagree on certain issues, and we can move forward in ministry together, and that's wonderful." But that's not enough for all people. And so basically, I love the way there's a pastor up in, Virginia, right? Tom Berlin, Virginia? Yeah, Tom Berlin in Virginia did this with sugar packets on a coffee table one day or at a diner, and basically shared that there are people fall in four areas in this conversation. You have, to the right, your traditionalists. And traditionalists would say, the Bible is very clear on this. Same-sex marriage is a sin. That's on the very traditional side. And they would say, I cannot be a part of a denomination that would allow for that to happen. Then you come towards the middle, and you have traditional compatibilists. And compatibilists would say, yes, I believe that homosexuality is a sin, and if my church can decide on that together, then I'm okay with other churches deciding another way because I know that scholars approach this and have come out, good, well-meaning Christian scholars have come at this and have come out in different places. And some of that is the way that you study Scripture and where you come out as a result. And there are good Christians that come out on both sides of this issue. Basically, we disagree. And so there are traditionalists that are compatible with that and say, I can still be in a church as long as they allow me, our agency, our ability to choose on this particular subject. I can stay in ministry with a denomination that allows it to happen. And then you come over to the left, and you have the progressive side, which will be on the far left. Now, this side is going to say that it is wrong to discriminate against anyone. When Jesus says all, love all, that means all, and you'll hear that. And this side will say, we cannot stay in a denomination that allows for discrimination to happen at any church. And that's going to be way on the left. As you come to the center, you will have progressive compatibilists that would say, we do not believe that anyone should be discriminated against. However, we see that good people disagree on this issue, and we can be in ministry with these churches. And because of these four positions, what I believe is going to happen is that we're going to see a splintering. And I want to be very careful about language here because some folks are saying that there's going to be a split. And a split would to me suggest that there's two different directions and two different things that are going to form after it. The reason I like the language of splinter is because you're going to see a group of traditionalists that will splinter away from the continuing United Methodist Church, and you'll see a group of progressives that will splinter away from the continuing United Methodist Church. But by and large, the United Methodist Church is going to continue. And it's going to continue in the way that it has been, and we'll move forward together in ministry. And that is most of the church. So by and large, we will see most United Methodist churches stay with our United Methodist Church and continue in ministry together. So that's why I prefer language of a splinter rather than a split. And it could be that if your church falls into that compatibilist range, where some assurance that you will be able to live out your conscience in the area of human sexuality, that your church will never need to vote on this. You just continue living into ministry the way that you are. If your church leadership, your church council feels like conversation needs to be had and that there needs to be a vote moving forward toward disaffiliation, then your church council, the next step would be to contact me, and I would send them the questions asking, what are your reasons for wanting disaffiliation? You would send me those responses. I would judge those to be appropriate, and then we would move forward into a checklist where you would provide documents that would be necessary for disaffiliation and transferring property from one place to another. And then we would create a ballot that would go before our annual conference that every church member of Epworth would then have the ability to vote on, and we would need 66%, 67% of the membership of Epworth to vote, yes, we want to disaffiliate and put this petition forward to the annual conference. Once Epworth votes on that, that goes to our conference trustees, and we work out all of the particulars and what that would look like, and then that goes to our annual conference, where our annual conference votes on whether or not to allow for the disaffiliation. So you will see at our annual conference, in person this year, we will see at our annual conference some disaffiliations this year that are going to be on the docket for vote. And then once that vote takes place and is approved, then we can start working on actually transferring assets, property from the United Methodist Church into whatever denomination or independent entity that the church decides to move to. That's the whole process in a nutshell. The most difficult points on that process come from when a church has debt. Epworth have debt? We do not. you're in a good place. Sometimes when a church has debt, it becomes difficult because banks really have a difficult time moving a loan from an existing organization that's connected to a denomination that's been around for a long, long time to a brand new organization that does not have any history or financial roots. And so that's been a hang up for some churches trying to disaffiliate. But that's usually where the big process issue comes into play, just trying to make that transition happen. But that's the transition in a nutshell. And I feel like I've done a lot of talking, so I will open up for specific questions, and I feel like I've probably created questions, which is part of that hope of having conversation.
Any questions you'd like to ask, either in written form or if you'd like to make use of the microphone, so that folks live streaming and folks at home will be able to hear. Any questions at this point?
Or Andy, you want to pop in?
Microphone or...
We'll take a question, then I'll let Andy pop in too.
Who wants to go first? Steve?
Thank you. Do I understand that with the protocol style settlement, where a church would be able to decide its own view on sexuality, that would be by vote of that church, and then there could be another vote later? In other words, it would be an open question for that church in perpetuity, which way that church would lean based on whatever the current vote was.
Great, thank you. Yes, so yeah, that becomes the decision, because remember, the United Methodist Church is not a congregational church, which means that the congregation typically does not weigh in on the governance of the church. The church council, that's the governing board. So if the church council were to decide, in this particular case with an extended profile, from recommendation of the staff parish, if the church council were to decide, hey, we want to ask for an extended profile, the church council can do that, and that's just calling my office and saying, hey, we'd like an extended profile. So that doesn't have to be a church-wide vote. It doesn't have to be an extended thing. It can just be the leadership of the church deciding we want to ask for this extended profile. And then the extended profile, the way that we've arranged that is that it gets put in place for a period of 3 years, and then we'll review it after 3 years. Part of the reason for that is to make sure that we're following any current rules that might come and supersede our ability to do that. Although I'll say that, and Andy, you can correct me if I'm wrong here, I've seen one piece of legislature go to General Conference that had no chance of making it whatsoever, and that's the only piece. Every other piece of legislature would have allowed a church to decide its own conscience. The chance, I mean, this is just, again, this is an area where people like to raise the anxiety and sometimes invent something that's just not there. There's not been a push to force a church to do something against its will, not at the local level. Did that answer? Did that get to it? Did you want to? Oh.
I think he just answered it.
Oh, okay. You just got the answer you wanted?
I think. Dr. Dan. So just to reiterate that answer, Epworth can remain a United Methodist Church congregation, not disaffiliate, and have the opportunity to influence what type of pastoral leadership we have. Just as, well, yes, as we do now, but especially through the extended profile. We don't have to change, and we get to influence pastoral leadership without disaffiliation. Thank you.
I'm not sure who's first. Judy, you had something? Okay. Here you go, Chris.
Thanks. Just a question on timing. Doesn't paragraph 2553 have a time limit?
Thank you so much. That is a great question. And the answer is yes. So this is something that can create anxiety when you talk about a time limit. 2553 was added into our discipline with the understanding that we would have a general conference to decide on this in a more concrete way. So it had an expiration date of December 31st, 2023. So if your church were to decide to go with paragraph 2553 this year or next year, as long as you got it before annual conference of next year, you would be able to disaffiliate under 2553. There will be, and I've been pretty good about predicting whether or not there would be a general conference. And again, I can't promise you, but all signs point to there will be a general conference in 2024. So there will be about a 4-month window where there is no path for disaffiliation. From December 31st to May of 2024, there will not be a path for disaffiliation around this issue of human sexuality. To me, and sometimes I give advice that I don't know if I should give or not. You know, it's kind of an awkward place being a United Methodist pastor who is definitely United Methodist and having friends whom I love that are WCA and wanting to move to the GMC. I've given them the advice, my personal advice, wait until the next general conference. And the reason why I give that advice is because if that protocol would have passed, you would still be under the same regulations, the same financial obligation that you are now, except you wouldn't have to do the pension all at once. There would be an avenue to continue to work with Westpath. And that could ease the financial burden significantly. So I don't know if I should give that advice or not out loud, but my heart compels me. So what I'm saying there to answer that question is, yes, there is a deadline for 2553, but the 2024 General Conference will address that and create a different path forward that I feel will be more advantageous.
Let me hand this to Judy first, and then Bob had a question you wanted to ask.
If a church is traditional and then you give your tithes and offerings and you stay in the Methodist church, that money is going to go toward things that you don't believe in, and personally I couldn't give money to that. And also I don't see how having 4 sections of a church and every congregation deciding their beliefs, how that's united.
Thank you.
Yes, sure, certainly. So the issue that's raised is basically if we're contributing money to the church, that I have a personal objection. I'm just trying to restate a personal objection, conscientious objection to any funds that I might give to the church that might support homosexual ministry or same-sex weddings or same-sex pastors or same-sex bishops or same-sex bishops. That didn't come out right. Homosexual bishops, thank you. Bishops who are part of the LGBTQ plus community. So that is an issue that I hear raised, and there are several ways that I could come at this. One is that it sounds to me like that starts to move you toward that traditional incompatibilist position. And there tends to be, when that is the position, there tends to be way more at stake than just finances. And so answering the financial question is only going to answer a part of that issue. And I realize that. And some of that would go into scripture and talking about other issues and how they relate and what the meaning and definition of sin is, and tradition and reason and experience and all of the things that United Methodists put into making decisions. So some of that I'm not really going to be able to address. But let me talk a little bit about the financial piece. Very little, very, very little of any dollar that is given to the United Methodist Church is assigned sexuality. Right now, technically it's zero. That's just the rule. If rules were to change, then money that's put into an overall pool, you could say some of that then is divided by percentage to a bishop who might be homosexual. My response to that has been that there are ministries of the church that I am more excited about than others, always. My personal favorite is UMCOR, the United Methodist Commission on Relief. That is an organization that helps people in disasters. And part of every dollar that you give in the connectional giving goes to the infrastructure, the overhead cost of running UMCOR, so that when there's a disaster, every single dollar that is given toward that disaster goes straight to victims. And because I grew up on the Gulf Coast, I got to witness the UMCOR van coming first and leaving last in my community several times. Very powerful. So when I give, I know that I'm giving to that. I also know that I'm giving to some things that I might not have as much interest in.
I don't think you understand really what I was saying is you're giving to something that you don't believe in.
So the fact that you're giving to something that you don't believe in or goes contrary to your conscience, yes. Now, that, again, how much are you giving to that? Is it making a big difference? Because most of what you give will go to the local church. Some of what you give goes into the apportionment system. Some of that gets distributed out. And as of right now, none of that goes to ministry that is attached with the issue of sexuality. So, you know, the idea that so the question was, well, really it wasn't a question, it was a statement. The statement was, I'm uncomfortable giving to something that would support human sexuality beliefs that go against my conscience. And that's just a statement. Do you want to?
So again, I'm Andy, and we live closer to this United Methodist Church than any other United Methodist Church out there. And so we're glad to be here. A quick aside, Dan talked about the extended profile. When Sally was the DS here, this is in some sense nothing new. Sally would meet with your SPRC and say, what kind of pastor do you want? And you would tell her, and she would do everything in her ability to make sure that happens. And sometimes the cabinet gets that right, and sometimes it doesn't happen. And in our system, if it doesn't work well, then they move the person and try again. But you've always had a right to ask, I would like this kind of pastor, or we would prefer this. I'm not going to go back through all of what Dan said. I think it's really important to know what the current reality is. Dan was very bold about talking about the future. The current reality in the discipline of the United Methodist Church is if you are a self-professed, practicing homosexual, you may not be ordained. Bottom line. That's it. People have attempted, and I was in the room. I've been in the room for 40 years when this has been debated. That has not changed. And as I look at voting patterns in our denomination, especially as I watch the increase in numbers of people from Central America, from Africa, from the Philippines, it's not going to change. I don't see the votes there. I don't see the votes happening. Likewise, our denomination forbids same-sex weddings in our United Methodist congregations. Now, clearly there's some people who violate that, but they have violated the law, but the law remains the same. You may not do a same-sex wedding. So if Bill shows up and does that, you can complain to the DS and he will make a phone call to Bill about that. That will happen. Likewise, the issue of money, it is in our discipline. No money can be given to any group that advocates for the full acceptance of gay, lesbian, transsexual, and the list goes on and on. That is forbidden in our denomination. I've sat on the committees and somebody say, let's do this. And somebody said, wait, look at their part of their agenda. And their agenda is doing that. And we said, we cannot give them money. We have stopped that stuff. And so the future, we just don't know. But the current reality is a self-professed practicing gay or lesbian person will not be ordained in the Western North Carolina Conference and will not be appointed to your church. That would take action at General Conference, and it may happen in 24, but as I count votes, I don't think that's going to change. Likewise, same-sex marriages, not going to change. The use of money is not going to change. 10 years from now, 20 years from now, it may. Who knows? But I think part of the anxiety is, and let's be clear, there are people clearly violating the rules, and that's an issue that the bishops have to deal with, is how do we deal with congregations and pastors who violate the rules, but they have to do pastors who violate rules on all sorts of things. And so one of the things is, I think part of the discussion is what's going to happen next year? What's going to happen 3 years from now? What's going to happen 5, 10, 20 years from now? Who knows? Who knows? I personally think Jesus will come back before the United Methodist Church resolves this. I just don't see us. I don't see us coming to any happy thing that makes everybody happy. I don't see that happening. But be clear about what the reality is, and what Dan said was very important. You are not under any compulsion to vote. You must choose to vote by action of the church council. And I was talking to a local pastor who is very conservative, who serves a very conservative congregation in our community. And he said to me, I've said to my congregation, let's just sit still. Let's see where this thing goes. We don't have to take a vote right now. And my personal pastoral feel is if you take a vote, which is certainly your right, in our political world, when you take a vote, 5, 10, 20, 30, 40, 49.5% of the people will be counted as losers. And the same number will be counted, a different number will be counted as winners. And people that you have chosen to worship beside and work beside and go to their weddings, watch the baptism of their children, people with whom you have been in community with over and over again. And then say, we're going to take a vote and you voted the wrong way and I'm not going to deal with you anymore. I don't want to be in a church with you. That scares me to death. Dave Phillips convinced me to run for city council. One of the things became very clear, and I mention him to God often. that most of the issues are not political issues. The water, the sewer, the paving of the roads. We just have to figure out what's the best thing to do in the time when the reality hits us. And as far as I've been on state council for 2 years, we've not had a Democrat versus Republican vote. We just don't, that just doesn't factor in. It doesn't work that way. And I think in the church, if we, that's the thing that scares me a little bit about the model. You know, we got people on this side, and we've got people on this side, we've got people. Quit labeling people. Quit labeling people. You know, these are your Christian colleagues. And not just in this church, and I'll finish. You are in community with the other United Methodists in this town. But we also have community with other churches in this town. He was talking about a committal relationship. We have formal relationships with the Episcopalians, with the Lutherans, with the UCCs, with the AME, the AEZ. We have formal relationships with the Roman Catholic Church, the Orthodox Church. I mean, we're in community as much as it hurts with the Russian Orthodox Church. If we baptize somebody at this congregation, you are welcome to join the Russian Orthodox Church without being rebaptized because you have been baptized as a Christian. They recognize us as part of the Christian family. So anyway, my argument is focus on what is rather than what can be. I've sent Bill it's too long, 21-page paper about how we got to this point, and he can certainly forward that to anybody who needs help going to sleep. But focus on what is rather than what might be. That's my...
Yeah, just a quick question. And the question I had in writing was asking what was the UMC's official stance on human sexuality, and I think that was touched on already. It was answered. That question was answered. The question I had was a pretty logistical question, and thinking about, and this is for me personally, and that is the deadline for the 2553 provision is December 31st, 2023. Again, this is pulling out a crystal ball here, but knowing that last step is annual conference has to vote to approve that departure, then really the deadline is June of next year, unless, and what would be the process if there were a lot of churches that suddenly come up and could not get everything done before June, of the possibility of a called annual conference maybe in the fall of next year to address those, or maybe even as late as December to vote just on those church departures?
Fantastic question. So in order to, the December 31st deadline for next year for paragraph 2553 means that everything must be complete, including having a new church to transfer all property to. All of that must be finished by December 31st. So you do have to kind of back it up a little bit. So it would need to go before annual conference next year. It would need to go before a church conference by the end of April of 2023. So that's really what you're looking at for a church conference vote, April 2023. And then the conference itself, we've got plenty of bandwidth to handle a lot of disaffiliations from the conference standpoint. The question becomes working with banks and title companies and making sure all the transfers happen. For a situation like what we would have here at Epworth, I would not anticipate that being difficult to accomplish in 6 months' time. However, just to add some peace of mind, perhaps, I can't promise anything here, there is a petition to annual conference to have a called annual conference that addresses solely disaffiliations. And I can't speak to whether or not that would pass. I haven't even seen the language of that to be able to guess whether it'll be ruled in order or not. But I can tell you that our bishop is predisposed to the idea of having a called annual conference, and he has the authority to call it. So basically, if we have a lot of disaffiliations that come that need that extra time, we are willing to have that extra annual conference to deal with that legislation. So I don't feel a lot of pinch or pressure there. I think we'll manage that. Yes, sir.
Let me take a microphone. Let me bring the microphone to you. So that the folks at home can hear.
My question is purely financial. Will the church be given the number before the vote? Because it doesn't do any good, no matter what anybody thinks and how anybody feels. If we can't afford it, we can't afford it.
I'm getting my steps in today.
And stay right here, because the number has been given, and I don't remember what it is. Do you?
No, I don't.
So, yes. I sent the number, right?
No, I didn't receive that from you. Let me double check.
Okay, so the number exists, and yes, I can give that number. I brought my iPad just in case some sort of question like that came. Maybe I didn't request the number. So the way that works is that we get, especially the pension liability, we get straight from Westpath. So when a church emails me, asks for a number, I go to our conference treasurer who works with Westpath for those numbers, and then we give it back to the church. It's a really quick process, really. It only takes a couple of days for me to get that back. And I thought that I'd done that for Epworth, but I might not have. It might be just because we requested the conversation and didn't actually request to enter the process. But I can get those numbers for you, yes. And I've stopped even trying to guess what those numbers are, because my guesses, I'm usually a pretty good guesser and estimator at things, but I have not figured out how to guess on these particular numbers yet. So I'll look in my iPad when we move to a different conversation, see if I do have those numbers. But I might not have pulled them. But the answer to your question is yes, we can get those numbers for you really in a quick manner.
Thank you. My question is one I have not heard addressed, and that is, let's just say that Epworth does choose to leave. I'm very concerned about what impact that has on the pastor. I don't mean just Bill personally. I'm saying whoever is at a church. What impact does that have? Do they have a choice as to what they do, or how could you talk about that a little bit, please?
Thank you. Great question. So there are two pieces to this kind of conversation, and one is the congregational piece and the other is the pastoral piece, because the two are not necessarily married to each other. And for a pastor, that is the pastor's decision alone for the pastor. So part of this, before we have a church conference vote, we ask the pastor to submit a letter to my office declaring intentions to either move with the church into the new denomination, move into some other denomination or relationship with another church, stay United Methodist, or in some circumstances retire. And then we take those wishes and we work with them accordingly. The United Methodist Church can only guarantee so much in that process, and I think that's important for people to know, because if for example, Bill were to send me a note saying that I would like to continue being with the United Methodist Church, then I would help Bill find another church in the United Methodist Church to serve. If Bill says he wants to stay with Epworth, then that's great. We'll help him do that. That does mean, because of the rules and the discipline, you cannot be ordained in the United Methodist Church and in another denomination. So that would mean surrendering credentials in the United Methodist Church to become ordained in the new denomination. And the caution that I give pastors with that is, I can't guarantee you that if, I'm going to use Epworth as the example because that's where I am, if Epworth goes to the GMC, that Epworth keeps you. My authority ends there. So I know of one GMC church, one church that's planning on moving the GMC, that plans to fire their pastor immediately, and the pastor doesn't know that. So, I just have to have that, I just bring that up for caution and clarity, that our authority as a United Methodist district superintendent ends upon disaffiliation. So I can't put a pastor, some church asked one of our district superintendents, will you still send pastors to us if we disaffiliate? The answer is no. Our authority ends at that point. That's a great question, and I'm making some light, but it is a serious thing to take a step back and think about all of those things. And that's part of, I'll have a conversation if we were to go through with this process. At some point I come and I visit with the church council, and I will talk about some of the things that churches need to think about. For example, pastoral leadership. And I'm begging churches, this is just on my heart, to make sure to have it within your DNA to carry with you some of the advances we've made in ministry. It will be difficult in a new denomination to continue the work of supporting clergy women the way that the United Methodist Church has in a very forward way. And that's a place where we have grown. And it's a place where I get concerned in some places, and I've heard some good things from the GMC working toward including clergy women, and I'm encouraged by that. I know some other denominations that it would go backwards, to go back to a place where we do not ordain clergy women. And so my encouragement is have those conversations now about what that looks like in the future. How can you make sure that you will continue those practices? How will you ensure that a new denomination would continue the work of equity and justice, diversity in the church? Those are all things that I just make sure. A couple other things, I see some more questions. Making sure to know that when you go into the new organization, that any legal liability travels with you. So if you've had Boy Scouts and are part of the Boy Scout lawsuits, all of the support from the United Methodist Church ends, and your church would carry that. Any lawsuits around practices of pastors in the past, all of that would travel with you to the new organization, and we would no longer be able to support you in that. Those are just some of the types of things. I've got a checklist of things that I go over with the church just to make sure you think about those, because that means going back through, making sure you have all of your insurance policies from the past so that you can take that with you into your new place to make sure that you can call the right people if something happens, because we wouldn't be able to help you with that.
Thank you. I've got just based on what you just said, I've got a statement and also a question. We talked about fear and anxiety. We were supposed to keep this focused on the homosexual issue of marriages and clergy, but you just mentioned ordination of women. In the WCA, there are two very strong women who have an active leadership role, Carolyn Moore, Angela Pleasance. So you acknowledge that. So you don't think that's a real possibility. You do not think that, there's a little seed been sown here. And, back to my reply. Yes, sir.
So folks can hear.
Going back to my reply, if you play back the tape, you will have heard me say that I've seen some very strong indications that the GMC is doing some good things there. There are some other denominations where that might not be the case.
So one more piece about that. We have had in our system, the bishop appoints to the local congregation. That will continue in the United Methodist Church. What's unclear to me, looking at the WCA, the Global Methodist Church thing, they don't have a discipline. So it's very unclear to me who appoints to a local congregation. And I've seen two documents, one of which said, we will name new bishops and new bishops will assign clergy to congregations. The other document said every congregation seeks out and votes on its own pastor. Those are two different options that will not be resolved with the Global Methodist Church until 18 months after it is established. They're very clear about that. We haven't decided how congregations get pastors.
And I'm going to let you finish, John. I'm going to say, please remember also, Jeff Patterson with the WCA will be here next week, so that'd be a good question to bring before you.
My other question has to do with pensions and Westpath. To me, and I think it's obvious to a lot of people, that over the next several years, there's going to be some changing of membership from one church to another church for whatever reason within the Wesleyan system. I think people of good faith and people of good intent could sit down and hammer out an agreement with Westpath, also come to agreement amongst themselves. I don't think totally we're going to lose that many pastors. Pastors may change their affiliation. But if Westpath continues to be the investment tool for the pensions, for GMC and UMC, there shouldn't have to be any upfront money paid. But I think that depends on people of good intent and good faith sitting down and to work this out so there won't be animosity on either side.
You're right, and there's going to need to be some general conference action to pave the way for Westpath to be able to service both denominations, and I think that would be something that's worked on in general conference. I'm a little less conversant on that. Andy might be able to fill in more, but I think, yeah, go ahead. And as I'll let you speak to that. And I also wanted to say that I hope that my comments earlier about just caution, I hope that you would receive that. I know that there would be some folks in a room this size that would be part of a conversation of a Global Methodist Church forming. And I hope that you would receive what I said as my own hopes and desires for people whom I love going into a new thing, is that you would continue those conversations, and I encourage that with the GMC about ordaining clergywomen specifically and issues of diversity, that I think these are good things that the United Methodist Church has done that I would hope a new denomination would carry forward. And so I don't deliver that as, it wasn't my intention to deliver that as anything to produce anxiety, more than it would be for me to encourage a new thing in the denomination. So for Westpath, is there, go ahead with that little distinction. I think it might be important.
Yeah. So Westpath used to be known as the United Methodist Pensions Board of Pensions. They changed their name 10 years ago knowing this was happening. So they are now serving not only the United Methodist Church, but several other denominations. And they said they will work with the Global Methodist Church if it is formed. They're very clear about that. They want to work with that. Their trick is they have, by federal law, legal obligations of paying for pensions for those who have been in the system, some of whom have going back 50 years. Part of the federal regulations is, do you guarantee resources and property to pay all of that stuff. And because of the United Methodist Church's trust clause, they say we have the potential to pay out the $2 billion in unfunded liability. If there's a church not associated with them for whom they don't have access to your trust clause, they can't use that to fulfill federal regulations. So they can't just take a promissory note that is against federal law. They've got to be paid up front. Now, again, it's a tricky thing, but it can be debated. Yeah.
Under West Pass, 10 years ago or whatever, when they accepted other denominations' payments into pensions, do all of these denominations have a trust clause?
Yes, they guarantee with
Okay.
property and resources sufficient funds to cover. Yeah.
Okay. Are these denominations, what are they? I'm just curious.
They are fairly small, and those other denominations are fairly small. Some are even individual congregations. But Westpath is hoping to become the major funder of all Protestant pensions in this country. They're moving down that road. Well, every church does it a little bit differently, but the federal government has specific rules of how you guarantee those monies. Yeah.
From the smaller denominations that Westpath services, what collateral do they put up? Is there guarantee?
And the answer is varied, but property is, of course, the number one go-to for the assets. To put I forget the technical term, but it's some sort of secondary lien or some item that is a deeded restriction. Boy, I was going to go in another little slight direction also, and I can't remember where that was, so maybe that'll come back to me in a moment. All right, next question. It'll come back to me.
So I promise you I'm going to try to make this a question, but it's going to start off like a statement. So what we have read and what we have watched in the United Methodist Church among the bishops, especially on the West Coast and in some areas in the Midwest, is that they have allowed and they have ordained LGBTQ. Actually, we read that there was one conference that said we're not going to follow the Book of Order. I understand and I agree with the Book of Order and what the United Methodist Church says as their stance on sexuality. But that doesn't seem like where the leadership or a lot of the bishops are going. And I think this is where a lot of the angst comes and why we're asking these questions. So what are the bishops' plans? I mean, because they are the ones that are setting the example.
Well, that is a fantastic question to put the finger on a pulse of an issue and one of the pinch points of this entire conversation. So, we are in this position where we have a set of rules and not everyone follows them. What do we do about that? What is the punishment for that? And what are the processes of making correction? And there has been disagreement among different leaders of different areas of the church on how that works. And different areas have different processes of working through these kind of complaints. So if it is a bishop, for example, that is that has a complaint brought against her or him, that is resolved in a different way than if it is a pastor in a conference and by a different body. And there is no real across-the-board distinction of how that works at this time. So for right now, where we are is we are in this process where we have basically agreed to be in abeyance, where we are not prosecuting trials on this particular issue until we have clarity from the next general conference. And at the next general conference, that will be a place where we decide, what do we do with all this? That's one of the key roles of the next general conference, is to say if someone is not in alignment or has a complaint about what's going on in the discipline, what is our common procedure? How does that work? And there's some definite challenges there, because for the rules that would apply to clergy, there's one set of things that can happen, and for bishops it's a different set. In order to change that would require votes in the supermajority category to make constitutional amendments. So there's a lot of work to be had at the next general conference. And because of that, I can't predict exactly how that's going to go, and different people predict different things. This is part of the reason why I think that we would end up in a place where churches would decide, and that power would become more at the local church level for clergy and the own practice. That's me being practical and saying I'm not sure we can get all of that done at 2024. But my hope is that we will come out with a direction that we can follow that would say, here are the guidelines. Because right now those do not exist in a way, they sort of exist, but they don't exist in a way that was approved by our judicial council. We have that whole system of checks and balances, just like our system of government here in America, where we have the legislative body, we have the executive branch and the bishops, and we have a judicial council, which is like our Supreme Court. And our Supreme Court has had issues with some of the things that were decided at the last general conference, and those will need to be revisited, and were supposed to be revisited in 2020. They were supposed to be revisited now in 2022, and because of all the COVID and backing things up, now will be revisited in 2024. So there's been a longer period of time than really anyone would have liked in this. So that is part of the importance of a 2024, is that the answer to your question won't really exist until then. How is that for, I don't know? That's better than me just saying I don't know.
Do you see why I wanted everybody to sit toward the front?
So again, try not to make a statement, but looking at that it is our bishops, our leadership, that are violating the book of order. How do they expect the rank and file, the churches, to follow them? And I'm having that is really my major concern is that's your rule, but now they have decided, well, we put social justice over the gospel, and that's really where my major question or problem is.
Yes, and this, I'll let Andy take a crack at this one, and then remind me. I'll come back and talk about a little bit of the complexity in rules.
So as United Methodist, we have this thing called the Book of Discipline, which is this big, thick book. The current discipline that rules does not give our council of bishops or anybody else the power to censure any one of its members. It never occurred to them that would ever come a need to do that. And so you say, well, they should do something about that. Our discipline technically does not allow that to happen. And that's one of the real frustrations. And so there's legislation coming that's going to deal with those kind of things. But as Steve knows, every time you write a law, then there are 3 things that we didn't cover. And so we have to rewrite the law, and we have to do that. So it's exceptionally frustrating to the other bishops, to the council of bishops, to the general church, when a bishop does something that clearly seems to be opposed to the discipline, but the discipline doesn't give the power to undo that. And that's just really, that is anxiety producing. that is stressful. And we're trying to work through that. And how things keep changing. And again, I think it's a cute one. When my father was ordained in 1951, the only 2 things you had to answer about whether you were ordained is if you smoked or drank alcohol. If you did one of those 2 things, you could not be ordained a United Methodist minister. Later on, they got rid of those, and one of the new rules is if you're divorced, you may never be ordained as United Methodist pastor. You get divorced? Well, that's changed some over time. We did have a rule, is your lifestyle compatible with the gospel, which I think is a pretty good question. I think that's a good question. But it's when somebody violates what kind of, I would argue, is common understanding. How do you enforce that? In the conference, the bishop and the cabinet have the opportunity to enforce rules. They can, Sally did it, Dan's did it, somebody screws up, you're not there next Sunday. I remember Sally one Sunday got to go on a Sunday morning and say, by the way, your pastor's not going to be here from this point on, and they've moved out of the parsonage because they did something inappropriate. I'm glad I wasn't there for that. And it wasn't me. But but enforcement is a real issue. Enforcement is a real issue for which we don't have an answer right now. But that's frustrating as all get out.
Yeah, and that's a great, well said. Thank you, Andy. And it also goes back to, again, this is kind of a debate in Scripture. It's a debate in the discipline. Do we enforce all rules the same? Because there are certain rules that are listed in the same manner as human sexuality in the discipline that are not followed, that nobody gets in trouble for. It just kind of looks the other way. And what things in the discipline are suggestions? What are rules? What are the procedures for clarifying complaints? All of those things are things that I'm hoping for more direction in the next general conferences.
I would first make a comment to what Andy just said, and that would be for a conference, for a group that's been in existence since 1964? 1968. And with all the smart people that we supposedly have in this church leading as being leaders of our church, all the great universities they go to, and they have a book of discipline this thick, and they can't enforce it, that would be a problem to me. I can promise you at my company, I have a book of discipline and I can enforce it, okay? So this is another problem with the Methodist Church, that the bureaucracy has gotten so big that it can't be handled. And that's a problem. The next thing I would say,
the solution to that, you're going to joke, is look at the Roman Catholic model. The Pope gets to decide who's right and who's wrong, and nobody has a chance to tell him anything else. That's the alternative model when you have one person to make all the rules versus doing it. So, I mean, I'm sort of joking, but it's a crazy system. But certainly in your company, you can fire anybody who's screwed up.
again, I would disagree. It's pretty simple common sense. We know the people are breaking the rules. It needs to be dealt with. And again, the next point I would make is that all these folks breaking the rules. And I kind of was a little bit not sure I understood correct that maybe in the beginning we were saying that that we really didn't have clergy that were openly defying the rule. That maybe, I guess it's only people behind closed doors, whatever. But I would bring to your attention that in 2019, after the General Conference, or during the General Conference, there was 111 gay clergy that wrote a letter and signed it admitting that they were open gay clergy in the United Methodist Church, United States. Okay? We have a gay bishop that's been there since 2016. How does something like that happen when we have a discipline that says it don't happen? We currently have, by my understanding, and all this information's on the website, United Methodist Church website, the new leader of the Council of Bishops. Is that what you call them? So the way I understand it, so he's the leader of Council of Bishops. That means like he's the #1 guy. Is his name Thomas Bickerton? So the way I understand it, back in 2019, he performed the ordination of a lesbian pastor into full connection as a deacon in the Methodist Church. How do we get to that point? When we say, I understand what you're saying, that we're trying to keep the church in the center, and we may be thinking we are, but in reality, the leaders of the church are all going to the progressive side. That's where we're at. We're not staying in the center because all of our leadership is on the progressive side.
May I jump in a minute?
Oh, sure. You want to go?
I had told them that I was just going to sit and not talk. I've been out of the loop. I've been retired now 4 years, so I'm not really in on everything that's going on in our denomination these days. First off, to say, I really applaud you all for having this open conversation. For the process you're following to figure out what you as a local church want to do. And Bill, thank you for your leadership, and Dan for your willingness to come and participate, and next week for Jeff to come. I think this is healthy. But I think as we're now hearing, this is what's happening, that we as a denomination are not of one mind. And that certainly has been going on since, I think Andy mentioned, certainly in your paper, that when your father at first surfaced at General Conference was in 1976. It has been part of our discussion as a denomination since then. So I think we're at a boiling point. And so this is what's happening, is that we're not of all one mind. I mean, I would argue, Jeff, that all of the leadership are not progressive. All of the leadership are not conservative. It's a mix, and there's great stress, I would think, among some cabinets when everyone sitting around the table. That was certainly a case when I was a DS. We weren't of one mind and had different opinions on human sexuality and a whole host of other things, issues. And that would be true of the bishops. They're not of one mind. And I think what we're now trying to do is figure out, how do we in Christian love figure this out? And there are those, it sounds like you all of that mind are just very clear what is right and wrong, and this is what the denomination needs to stand for and follow the rules. But there are others where it's not that clear. That is it time for there to be a new understanding of human sexuality. It's clear-cut to some, it's not clear-cut to others, and that's true in a local congregation. I would guess some congregations tend to be more conservative, traditional, some more progressive, but often we're a mix. And I would bet that's true of Epworth too, that as you all are having these conversations, that not everybody thinks the same way. And that makes it super challenging. But I trust that God's a part of these conversations. And God will lead us and guide us as a denomination, as new denominations are formed, as congregations decide what to do, as individuals decide what to do, that we aren't alone. At least that's what I'm trusting, that somehow we will come through this. But it just occurred to me when you were talking about the Book of Discipline, it's hard to enforce it when the whole body is at a different place. It's not just the leadership, it's members of the local churches, it's the pastors, that not everyone thinks and believes the same way. And that's always been, the church since day one has split over how to baptize, how to ordain, who to ordain, bishops or no bishops, what role clergy have, what role lay persons have. Since day one, there have been conflicts and splits. So in some sense, this is part of that ongoing process. One more thing, and I will hush. As a district superintendent of what was the Salisbury district, for the most years, that was my role as a DS. There were 63 local congregations in Rowan and Cabarrus County. And what I delighted in, what I loved, was the diversity. That there were small rural congregations, there were suburban congregations, there were downtown churches, and the mix, what we could do together, was so much greater than what any individual congregation could do. And there was a richness to that. The district women's group, the district men's, when the youth got together, when there was a mission trip, people from different churches, ministry was happening, even though people didn't think just alike. And I understand that there comes a time for some people where it's just clear cut that this church, this denomination is going down a road that doesn't fit what I believe. I think one in good conscience can make that decision. On the other hand, I think there's just a richness in differing opinions. I know I have grown over the years with being pushed in ways that I wouldn't have been if I'd hung out with people who thought just like I do. That I've appreciated the differences. And so I appreciate Epworth. I give thanks for your rich history. I give thanks that you're working on this and doing it openly. It seems much more better to do it this way than for people just to drift away, to leave, not to have conversations with one another. So thank you for that. And you will definitely be in my prayers in the days ahead. Bishop Carter and DS Dan will be too. As our conference, you all aren't the only church that's trying to figure out how do we address this in this day. Thank you, Bill.
Thank you. Thank you.
Okay, I'm going to take us back to 15, 20 minutes ago, okay? The protocol, that's the first thing that the Council of Bishops is going to address, or whoever's at conference next year, right? Is there any language in the protocol about creating enforcement procedures for people who have departed from the Book of Discipline?
So the protocol relates mostly to leaving the denomination. So it gives a pathway out for people when 2553, expecting 2553 to expire. So the protocol is mostly about voting for churches to leave. Now that's the protocol. One piece of the work of General Conference the next time that General Conference meets in 2024 will be to resolve the pending issues of enforcement. What does that look like? And there's going to be a lot of work. I can't sugarcoat that because it will involve constitutional amendments, and that means some really heavy work that would be ratified by annual conferences even after the General Conference vote. So it would take some time. And I just want to, say that there's a heavy road ahead to work on that and work that out. There are also some really good, faithful people that are working on it, and that gives me hope. So, just out of curiosity, how many, if we were to keep going with questions, how many questions are still out there?
I know we have two more.
Two more? Let's go to two, and then I feel the energy in the room kind of waning a little. We've been at this for a while, and Sally really kind of that would have been like the point to. Sally gave us that nice, great wrap up, and we're.
So I understand that it seems tentative about enforceability through the Book of Discipline, that it's a very fluid document, maybe on individual interpretation or different bodies' interpretation. Will the Global Methodist Church function differently? Or will there be those same types of uncertainties in a different congregation or a different organization?
I'm going to let Dan respond, but please remember, Jeff Patterson will be here next week. A good question for him.
Bill, that's the right answer. Jeff is the better person to respond to that question specifically. All I could answer in there is just some organizational management and leadership. You will always have outliers, always have folks that are pushing boundaries in different places, and your organization has to then determine how to deal with that. There are provisions for processing complaints in the United Methodist Church. Those provisions have been met and followed, and complaints in the United Methodist Church seek for what they call a just resolution. And what a just resolution is depends on the person who filed the complaint and the parties involved. So when we're talking about some of this, just knowing that complaint process is important, because what we might consider a just resolution in a complaint of someone across the country might not be what they considered a just resolution on a complaint. So that is part of what's going on in this particular situation. And I think Sally referenced that very well to say that this points out that we're not of like mind and how to deal with certain issues. So that's part of the complexity. This is a very complex system. We are a global United Methodist Church, and there are different rules for different parts of the world, even in central conferences and around, and it becomes a much more difficult conversation when you try to put all of that together under one umbrella. So that's part of the issue that I can speak to with us, and it would just be my imagination. I would just project that on any global body that you would have to have those kind of conversations and have the same kind of outlying issues that would pop up from time to time that you'd have to deal with.
So change is hard, and staying stagnant or stationary is also difficult when it seems like there are better options on the other side, even politics. But it seems like it's very uncertain, and I'll just leave it at that. Before a vote could possibly be taken, I think much more homework needs to be done.
Chris, did you want to go?
I was going to say, Pastor Sally, thank you for your words. It's not just with the beginning of the Methodist Church. It's the disciples had arguments about what it meant to be a faithful disciple. And Jesus answered that with grace. And he didn't kick anybody out because of who they were. He pushed their limits. And for me, the Methodist Church has always been about grace. That we offer grace to everyone. And grace is hard and grace is costly. And it hurts for us to have to listen to people who disagree with us and to actually hear them and to value them. But I want to say thank you to this church that you've allowed me to be a part of this church when some of my values may be different than your values. Because I know we all worship the same risen Lord. And I think that we need to keep the focus on the cross and on Jesus rather than on side issues. I grew up thinking, having read in the Bible, that women shouldn't wear jewelry. And my understanding changed when I met women who wore jewelry, who were godly women. And I grew up thinking that women couldn't be pastors. And then I met women who were pastors. And then I grew up believing that you couldn't be divorced and be a Christian. And then I met Christians who had been divorced. And grace moved me to a place that I realized it's not just about the way I understand the Bible. Maybe if reality is different than the way I interpret the Bible, maybe I'm interpreting the Bible. Maybe I need to learn a new way to interpret the Bible. But grace is what we're about. And whether we decide to leave or stay, I just encourage us all to give grace to each other. Amen.
Good job, Chris.
So I'm going to work toward bringing us to a close. I specifically did not go into a lot of focus on Scripture and where Scripture leads. It is not my desire in these conversations to try to convince anyone of anything on either side, except to say this. My desire, my hope would be that wherever you are on this particular conversation, that you would seek to understand where the other side is and how they get there. So to know that you can be of one place, that is fine. my hope would be that you could go and find out why a good Christian person could still be Christian and believe something different than what you believe, whether it's one side or the other. I think there comes something in understanding the other side that allows for some grace to happen, even if you disagree still. And like I say, I don't try to convince anyone of either side. I just happen to know that you can go through and you can do the study of Scripture. You can go through the Wesleyan quadrilateral of reason, experience, in tradition, and Scripture, and you can come out in two different places. And until you can actually work that and come out into both places, even if you favor one or the other, to me, you haven't quite done all of the work necessary to make a full decision. And that's something that you could explore with Pastor Bill and some resources that are available far and wide, and I'd be happy to work with you on that as well, to do that kind of spiritual work. I think some of the things that you said I want to bring back and just focus us there. We are in a time of making decisions. We are in a liminal space where COVID-19 has suspended our general conference and our ability to be proactionary and reactionary to some of these issues. And so that space is kind of uncomfortable. There is a group that is launching a new church that is trying to address some of the key issues here that some feel, and that's okay. You'll be hearing from Jeff next week about that. I just invite us to pray about the process and to continue to offer grace to those, especially with whom you disagree, even if that means doing that from another denomination. I think that is a wise word, that grace is important there. So as we close, what I would like to invite us to do, rather than me leading a prayer, which could be an extremely biased prayer, just because of my own personal biases, and I want to lead a prayer that will be pleasing in the sight of God and in the company of this congregation. What if we were to stand together and close by saying the Lord's Prayer together? Let's stand. And let us pray the words that Jesus taught us by saying, Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done, on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our trespasses, as we forgive those who trespass against us. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. For thine is the kingdom, and the power, and the glory forever. Amen. Amen, and may you go in peace.